Broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome to the Gailey Show, the only daily LGBTQ progressive radio news and talk show in the country. I'm your host, John Parker. Lots of news happening today. Coming up after us for the best in progressive news and analysis is the Matt McNeil Show on AM 950 Radio and Choose Views with Richard Chu on WCPT. For us today, it's our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest for the episode, the majority of the episode, to help us think more clearly and more queerly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. After that, I'll continue my Queer and the Cosmos essay series. Today, we're talking about the last 6 months. My guest is Cathy Renna. Cathy is the Director of Communications for the National LGBTQ Task Force. As the progressive voice of the LGBTQ movement and the LGBTQ voice of the progressive movement, the task force builds power, takes action, and creates change to achieve freedom, justice, and equity for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. Cathy is a veteran in the communications industry. She served as the National News Director for GLAAD and as Media Director for Fenton Communications, where her clients included MoveOn.org, the American Lung Association, and Wangari Maathai, the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2006, Cathy co-founded Target Q, a premier public relations and communications firm that focuses on LGBT and HIV-related issues and events and provides media training, strategic and crisis communication services to diverse nonprofit organizations. Folks, this is just a partial biography.
I was going to
Cathy,
say,
welcome back to the Gailey Show.
These things get, wow. I'm getting tired of this.
It's a lot. We have learned to celebrate. No more humility on the Gailey Show. We are championing ourselves. We're bragging. No more. Yeah, not even humble brags anymore. Straight out bragging. Well, okay, Cathy, welcome back. And I guess let's start with the broad view, if you will, about the last 6 months. I mean, when we look back on it, we knew what was in Project 2025. I mean, they weren't being vague about it. They were specific. It was written down. We all read it. And we knew what he was promising on the campaign trail. So generally, from your perspective and the task force perspective, the past 6 months, what we expected or worse?
I probably both, depending on what you're talking about. I mean, I think what we realized, long before, during the election, even long before the election was finalized and inauguration and that, I think that, the first Trump administration was like the JV squad. I mean, they weren't organized. They didn't have a plan. And then, of course, the far right wing provided a plan in Project 2025. So, we basically immediately saw things being put into place, things being proposed, executive orders being signed that they were shocking, but they weren't surprising, right? I mean, I love that phrase. And it's really true here. We had our Creating Change conference in Las Vegas, and it started 2 days after the inauguration. And I think it was really powerful to be in that space with several thousand other queer and allied progressive activists from across the country and across all kinds of parts of our movement in terms of, the diversity of representation. Mm-hmm. And I think because of that, it grounded us in what we were about to face. I think that was really helpful. I know it was helpful for the task force. I think it was also helpful for folks to be in that space, to deal with sort of the shock of the inauguration and the immediate actions, particularly against trans people and immigrants, and then go home knowing what the assignment was, frankly. And we're seeing it play out. We've watched it play out for the last 6 months, whether it was executive actions, whether it's things happening on the states in that sort of, trickle down way that, Trump has created what I like to call the permissible climate of hate, or whether it's the Supreme Court, right? We're seeing it everywhere. And I think it's very far-reaching. I think it's very deep and impactful in terms of not just the legislation and the communities, but even the very structure of our movement, the very structure of our culture, and of course, as we know, the very structure of our democracy. And 6 months in, we are seeing resistance. That is the most hopeful, encouraging thing. Is we're seeing literally millions of people get out in the streets. We saw last weekend on No Kings Day that people are done. They are, and even the folks who supported him, there are the never Trumpers and the no Trumpers, and folks are starting to realize, wait a second, first of all, he hasn't kept one promise that he made during the election, but he's also doing things that really fly in the face of the desires of even his base. Or maybe they're rethinking their decision, and they're getting voters' remorse. And I think the more that we can do to make those things continue to happen between now and the midterm elections, especially, is going to be really important.
You mentioned the executive orders, and we can't not miss those when we're looking back at the first half of this year. Something that has been kind of frustrating for me is that I'm like, well, there is no precedent in contemporary time, but Eisenhower did, for those of us that know our history, the Lavender Scare, President Eisenhower did this executive order that purged LGBTQ folks from all federal service. For you and your perspective and the work of the task force, like, are there lessons we can take from that period that we can apply to today? Because it just feels like on so much of this language is just almost word for word what President Eisenhower was doing in the 50s.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give the anti-LGBT and anti-progressive extremists one thing: they're on message. They never really changed their message. One of the things that we did during the conference, like literally the day of the inauguration, he started signing executive orders, was to really help explain. We created videos that we put on our social media. We show them at the plenaries that explained what an executive order is, especially in the context of today, what it really means. Just because he signed his EKG looking name on a big piece of paper with a bunch of cameras and people around him doesn't mean that it automatically becomes implemented, right? There are ways to fight these things, whether it's in the courts, whether it's through the Congress. I think that was part of for us, a real priority in the beginning, because what their desire was to really create panic and chaos. Mm-hmm. And, they did a pretty good job of it, but we also learned that we can fight back. And if you look at the losses in the courts that they experienced, especially in the beginning, that's a really important thing for people to take away from this, is that we still have power, and that we still have, God bless the lawyers, the ability to fight these things, on the front lines in the courts, not just in the court of public opinion. So, I think part of this is also something that our movement needs to grapple with more, is that so many of them were targeting trans folks, particularly trans youth. Mm-hmm. And that has continued to play out. It is continuing to be damaging. And of course, we just saw the Supreme Court decision on Scrimetti, US v. Scrimetti, that we really need to double down on doing all of the advocacy, whether it's political advocacy, cultural advocacy, media advocacy around trans issues, because we have a long way to go. But mm-hmm. at the same time, I think there's hope and there's energy, and there's a real desire on our part to do that. The key for me is going to be educating within our own larger LGBT community that trans issues need to be prioritized in the way, as we celebrated this week, marriage equality was. We just celebrated 10 years of, a Supreme Court decision that went our way, that went the way of justice and equality. And what has changed in those 10 years, and what did we do? What did we not do? I had a fascinating conversation with a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, and usually those things last 10 minutes. I was on the phone with him for an hour, because we really dug into the things that our movement needs to do, as much as our movement as a collective needs to be, outwardly doing around organizing.
I definitely want to get into that in our conversation today, because I want to leave on an upbeat note, as much as we can have an upbeat note. But I want folks to walk away from this conversation with very specific things that they can do in response to this. It's also very affirming to hear you say that, yes, we still do have power. That's something that was very different than the 50s, where we do have at least lower courts who are willing to rule in our favor and to issue, nationwide injunctions. How should we be thinking about the Supreme Court's actions over the past 6 months? You mentioned that Trump 1.0 was the JV team, and trans service members, like the trans ban, didn't really go anywhere in the first term. Like they lost everywhere. It's sort of kind of playing out the same way in the lower courts, but then the Supreme Court steps in and goes, no, you can go ahead and do it. It doesn't matter that the lower courts haven't resolved it yet. Just start firing them and getting rid of them. That's A-okay. Like, do we feel that that's them tipping their hand, that they're going to go forward and do with this? Like, how do we make sense of the Supreme Court over the past 6 months?
Well, I mean, this is what we all said during the election. And, I wish more people had really taken it seriously and understood. Like, that election was about electing a president, but it's also about electing who picks the next several Supreme Court justices, because that has ramifications for decades and decades, generations, possibly, depending on how young they are. And he's picked some younger people. So, it really is in many ways about the Supreme Court, because that's where things are going to continue to end up. I mean, the trans ban is devastating. I mean, I have so many colleagues and people. I worked on the Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal. And so many of those folks are engaged, Sue Fulton, Sparta, all of these organizations that worked so hard in the 90s and early 2000s, and then turned things around and had the ban, repealed. This is harder, because we've got some real challenges around educating folks around really who trans folks are. And what has been, very similar to when we worked on Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, letting folks actually see, meet, hear, understand, and take out of the abstract this group of people who, no matter how you feel about the military and war and the military industrial complex, these are trans folks, individuals who are willing to give their lives for this country and who are providing services with honor, with skill, and with success.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the idea that, even at Creating Change, at Prides, all this year, I've met, I've met pilots, I've met, folks who work on submarines. Like, I've worked folks who are, doing all kinds of work in the medical field, in the military, in all branches of the military. And they tend to actually be even more excellent because they are pushed to be excellent, because they know that they're dealing with, a challenge of being in a space that is, historically sexist, homophobic, transphobic, like racist. I mean, there are all these other issues within the military that, create the larger challenge for service members who don't fit in that, straight, cis, white, male, box.
Mm-hmm.
Where they're now fighting about women serving in combat. We're turning the clock back on a lot of things. And so,
yeah,
that's a particularly upsetting and devastating one for me, because I'm so familiar with folks.
I have to fit in a quick break here. We're going to have more with Cathy Renna for the National LGBTQ Task Force. For more progressive news and analysis, you can go to am950radio.com and heartlandsignal.com. You're listening to The Gailey Show. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm John Parker. We're coming up on the bottom of the hour. This is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest for the majority of the episode to take a deep dive into an issue facing the LGBTQ and allied community. Our issue today is the past 6 months. My guest is the Director of Communications for the National LGBTQ Task Force, Cathy Renna. Cathy, we were talking before the break about trans service members and the ban to have them kicked out of all service branches. Something that's different, you worked on Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal. Something to me, as just as on journalism side, is that a unique difference this time around is how the armed services are actually having recruiting problems. And they are kind of against this, the leadership. Whereas like in the 90s and, in the mid-aughts, they were like, no, we need to do studies to see how bad this is going to be. Whereas this time it's like, well, no, why are you doing this? And we already have a recruiting problem. Why are we going to get rid of tens of thousands of service members? Talk to me about the flip of that. That just seems so cognitive dissonance.
I mean, I think they learned their lesson. I remember one of the things that really was a turning point around the Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal was when it was shortly after 9/11, and people realized that a ton of the, out gay and lesbian service members that they were getting rid of were Arabic translators. And we needed those at the time. And so, just truly understanding the implications, especially in the context of increasingly, and you're right, even more so now, the challenges of recruitment in the armed forces. It's not, it is definitely not seen as appealing, especially for those who witness the way folks who, again, don't fit in that little small box are treated. And there's also historical understanding that, the military has always been, in many ways, I mean, I don't know, the best way to describe it is like an escape route for folks who are trying to get out of a country where economic injustice is rampant. So that's why you saw a disproportionate number of people of color joining the military, because it was a way to get out of, income challenges and economic challenges in their lives, because it would pay for college. It would offer them, economic security in a way that they may not have been able to access in their, in their day-to-day lives, right? And in this country. And so, yeah, I think that's interesting. I also think the other piece of this that's going to be important is leveraging the stories and the relationships that trans service members have with their colleagues. I mean, that was, having allies come out and talk about what it really does mean to, to work and fight beside someone who just happens to be trans. Like, it's the same arguments that we used before. Like, when you're in a foxhole, who cares? Like, when you're, out on a military assignment, who cares when you are ill and you're injured and you need to be taken care of, and the physician or the nurse or the EMT is trans? Like, who cares? I mean, what you care is that they're qualified and that they're true to their mission and they're true to their service for the country. So I think that's one thing that I think came out of it that we've been able to get past, and that's a good thing. I mean, again, like, these are all long fights we're dug in for. They're going to take a while. There's a lot of education that needs to happen. And, as we know, progress is not linear. And I truly believe that, we will persevere, we're resilient, and we're going to come back, and continue to fight these things till we get to the point where the pendulum swings back our way.
Mm-hmm. It's not an arc, it's a spiral, it feels like.
In some ways, yeah. Well, lately, yeah, that's for sure.
So last week, I'd be remiss not to ask about United States versus Scarametti. So the Supreme Court upheld the healthcare ban for trans kids, which was, when you get, I don't even know, I've had problems discussing it on the show because of the ridiculous argument that the majority made in there, that it wasn't actually about trans kids, it was about gender dysphoria and these medications, and it's still for adults that they can use them. And so this actually has nothing to do with trans people at all. And I was trying to follow the argument, and I was trying to follow people who were smarter than me, trying to explain it online. And I'm like, I don't even understand what's happening right now.
Yeah.
What has your reaction been, and the task force reaction been to this? And how do we begin to respond when the logic is so convoluted?
Well, it was totally. I mean, that decision actually could have been worse. And, I'll let Chase Strangio and the lawyers explain that even more. I mean, we just did a video that we're going to be putting out on social media because we're getting a ton of questions about what does heightened scrutiny really mean? Like, even if you Google it, you read it and you're like, does it really make sense? I mean, basically saying that the ban was subject to the lowest level of scrutiny because, it only discriminated based on age and diagnosis, not on sex or gender identity or trans status, which is idiotic if you really think about it, right? I mean, if this is about science, they made the argument that, well, culturally, this is not okay. It's not about culture. It's about every single medical association in this country saying that trans-affirming care is not only effective, it's the right thing to do. It saves lives. And my heart breaks for the trans families with trans kids that I know. I mean, we are in touch with folks they are literally, if they're able to, picking up and moving. Mm-hmm. I talked to a family that is very well known. They do a lot of media. They're on social media. In fact, Daniel Trujillo, he helped us with this video about heightened scrutiny. They're living in Europe right now because they could not get trans-affirming care in Arizona. And they didn't see moving around from state to state, because now what the Supreme Court has done is they've thrown it back to the states, which again creates the kind of patchwork we experienced around marriage equality, where it was okay to get trans-affirming care in one place and you drive 4 hours east and all of a sudden you can't. Right. Or being, when I was married in New York, but if I went to Virginia, I wasn't married anymore. Like, it was a decision that was disappointing, but I think at the same time, I think it's a decision that we can continue to fight and eventually, kind of get back into play in different ways. And we're going to have to fight it at the state level, because this argument has never held up at the state level, and yet it held up at the Supreme Court. Like, that is stunning to me. That is just,
willful.
Hard to understand. Right. Absolutely.
Willful. And we see also across the pond in the UK, where their Supreme Court did the same thing, and 50,000 members of the British Medical Association were like, I believe they used the word scientifically illiterate, that the court's opinion was scientifically illiterate. Right. You can fact check me on that, folks that are listening right now, but I believe that was the direct quote from their statement. We've even seen here in Minnesota, where we've had a lot of laws in there, where we've even fielded here on the show, folks reaching out to us on social media or just texting us going, what school district should I be looking at when we move here? Because we want to move here. We're coming from Montana. We're coming here from Arizona. We're coming here from St. Louis. Where do we even begin in looking at school districts? So we've been having to kind of keep a list of like, okay, well, if you're wanting to have this level of house, this is the district that you want to go. You know what I mean? Because some folks just can't. I mean, we have bad housing here in the cities too.
I say it all the time. Like, your rights should not depend on your zip code.
No, it shouldn't.
It's outrageous.
I have to fit in another break here. None of this, of what we're talking about today, and Progressive Radio would be possible without our generous advertisers and sponsors. Listen to them in this break. Give them a shout out on social media. Better shop with them, do business with them. Tell them that you heard about them here on The Gailey Show on AM 950, KTNF, and WCPT 820. Coming to you from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk on your morning drive. Welcome to The Gailey Show, the only daily LGBTQ progressive radio news and talk show in the country. I am your host, John Parker. It is 33 minutes after the hour. It's our weekly Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest for the majority of the episode to help us think more clearly and more queerly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. My guest today is Cathy Renna, the Director of Communications for the National LGBTQ Task Force. Cathy, you were mentioning in the break that we should talk about the multiple court cases that the court is ruling on that affect not just queer folks, but immigration, housing, healthcare is definitely going to be one coming up here that clearly queer people are being impacted by immigration cases. When we see the asylee Andre Hernandez Romero from Venezuela, who was, disappeared into a concentration camp and has no access to lawyers or anything. Can you talk about this legal environment that we're finding ourselves in on so many issues, where the court is implementing a regime that is very hostile, not just to the queer community, but to so many other communities?
Well, and the point is also that the queer community is part of all of those other communities.
Correct.
Too.
Yes.
So we have to care about any changes to birthright citizenship. We have to care about defunding Planned Parenthood, right? We have to care about all of the health insurance related things, because that will impact medication, services, HIV prevention. Our community is a microcosm of the larger culture. I say that all the time. And that's why the intersectional work that the task force does and that others do is so incredibly important, because we have to be looking at these things, with a 360 perspective and an intersectional, inclusive perspective. We're being impacted by what's happening in Los Angeles with ICE and in Newark, right down, 2 towns over from me, where I see, a mayor and, one of our elected officials getting arrested. We have to tie in what is happening to our community with the bigger picture of what is happening to erode our democracy. Because if we don't do that, and we don't kind of all come together on that, then that's going to make it that much harder to fight it. One of the things I really loved seeing last weekend was that for the No Kings protests, it fell on the same day as several prides, including Pride in Boston. So Pride in Boston, what did they do? They combined them. New York City Pride is this Sunday. Who's going to be at the very front of that march? Trans-affirming schools, trans youth, families with trans kids, trans adults. It's like when 3 years ago Roe v. Wade was overturned, and I was helping the New York City Pride folks get organized. It was on a Friday afternoon. Nobody came to our rally because they all went to the Roe rallies, which was fine. But on that Sunday, the very front of that march was Planned Parenthood and Maya Wiley and all the repro rights activists. That it wasn't just performative. It was to help our movement and our community understand that reproductive rights are queer rights. Bodily autonomy is an issue for all of us, particularly for queer people. That Planned Parenthood provides trans-affirming care to so many people. You shut them down, you shut trans-affirming care down. And so I think making the connection around all of these different decisions and issues and marginalized communities and movements that are being impacted is one of the most important things we can do right now. We really, really need to connect the dots.
Yes. And, something we've been trying to say is that, if you believe that healthcare should be between a person and their doctor, pro-choice, that is absolutely trans healthcare.
An argument, right?
That's a value. That's not just a policy statement. That's a value. The No Kings. I was actually at Marquette Pride in Michigan for that, which was a couple weeks ago for the No Kings protest. And obviously here in Minnesota, we were having a much different experience of that, talking about, an assault on our democracy with the assassination of our House Speaker Merida and her husband and other attacks on state officials. But you're bringing up something in terms of the intersectionality that folks have been, another aspect of this that folks have been wrestling with since the election, not just the past 6 months, which is, are we going down the Newsom route where he's telling his, legislature, don't give me anything queer, palling around with MAGA? He starts a podcast called This is Gavin Newsom. And his first episode is trans people in sports.
It's about me. Yeah,
right,
no,
right. And you have, but I know you're like, okay, yeah, all right, fine. A cis gay white politician, you expect a certain level of betrayal there. But then we see, Representative Sarah McBride in the New York Times interview going, did we overplay our hand? We've got Victory Impact Fund going, let's talk more about kitchen table issues. Let's not talk about, trans rights. And I'm of an age, I'm in my mid-40s now, where I remember how MAGA always makes a wedge issue out of us, whether we're talking about it or not. They're always turning us into a punching bag. And so then, this week we see Zohran Mamdani unabashedly, just proudly like, no, we are allies. I'm going to talk about trans rights, but we're also going to talk about economics. We can do both at the same time.
Right.
You're a communications expert. You've been doing this for so long and part of so many critical campaigns. What is your advice to queer folks and allies about how we should be meeting this moment from a communications strategy?
I was a reporter from the LA Times. I was telling him an anecdote. I was at the Democratic National Convention, right? And it was, I'd never been. It was a really interesting experience. I mean, my work has always been very, very sort of media storytelling, crisis communications focused. I would say political with a smaller P than the one where I am now at the task force, because that's what we do. And, this was a stadium filled with tens of thousands of people. And we fought to try and get a trans voice on that stage, and they said no, because I think it's fear. Everybody is, if you're driven by fear, then it's gonna take you a lot longer to get the job done than if you're not. You have to be brave. And so because they didn't give us that voice, my governor, Phil Murphy, took the moment when they did the roll call to say very famously, I'm from New Jersey and you're not, which that's very Jersey. Now that I lived here 10 years, wow, Jersey is interesting. I'm from New York originally. And then he handed the mic over. The governor handed the mic to one of our state level trans activists who introduced herself, said her pronouns, and said she was a proud trans woman. And that stadium erupted. I don't know what they're afraid of, because I think the reality is, yeah, we're going to have to deal with some stuff. I mean, we have to get over the misinformation and the lies and the hate and the bias and the prejudice that is, as a colleague of mine says, it's in the soil that we grow up in this stuff. We have to do it ourselves. We've got people in the queer community who need to get over their transphobia.
Yes.
We need people who went home after marriage equality and said, well, I'm good. I'm done. And you're like, we are so not done. We have so much to do. So I don't operate out of fear. Am I very protective of the people that are out there who are part of those groups, who are trans, who are not binary, who are people of color? Yeah. But at the same time, we have to find ways to do this work. And we also have to find ways to have these conversations. Kiera Johnson, our president, calls them principled struggle conversations. I would just call them like really hard conversations. I always try and simplify things, make them accessible. But seriously, those are the conversations that, short of sitting across a dining room table in a coffee shop, really just answering people's questions, trying to help them understand who we are, that's the work that needs to be done. And when the people in power aren't willing to do it, that's when I got a problem with that, because they should be brave because they have power and they're working and operating in institutions that actually can make a difference. So I think that's why you're seeing a lot of people who are very disappointed in, the Democrats as writ large, the Democratic Party. And you're seeing people like AOC stand up. You're seeing folks who are kind of going, okay, why are you all obsessed with trans people? Oh, I get it. You need a wedge issue. You need to scare people and say, look over here, and then do all this other stuff on the other side so that people don't notice how much you're hurting healthcare or Social Security or any of the other like institutional safety nets that have been created in this country, or just trying to, dismantle our democracy and bend the knee to this administration, which is, in the last week, what have we seen? I mean, he dropped the F-bomb on TV, but he's dropping real bombs too. And the impact of that it's global. I mean, like I said, I'm going to Italy on vacation. I'm going to be at Pride in Naples, Italy, not Naples, Florida. For the first time, I've never been to a Pride outside of this country. And, guess what? That Pride is going to be a huge protest as well as have elements of joy and celebration. So we can do two things at the same time. We can balance this. We can find ways to feed ourselves, keep ourselves safe, keep ourselves healthy, mentally healthy as much as we can under the stress and trauma of this administration. And we need to use that so that we can feed the fight.
We are actually going to be at Iceland Pride the first weekend of August. I can't wait to see. I've never been to an international Pride myself, so I'm going to be very excited. I just learned, excuse me, Pride is the largest festival in all of Iceland. Now, I know it's a few 100,000, population there, but I was like, really? That's so interesting to me that of all the possible festivals, that Pride would be the biggest one that they have there. So I'm going to be so curious to see what that is like, and also how they are responding. We're trying to also learn Iceland. How do you say in Icelandic, like, we hate Trump, we voted, we're lefties?
I was at World Pride, and I worked on World Pride in New York City in 2019. It was 5 million people. And he was in office, but again, it was the first term. It was rough. I really felt for my family, their family. I mean, that banner, that sash behind me was a Capitol Pride hero this year. I love Capitol Pride. It was where I grew up in the 90s as an activist in DC, and I worked with them. They were a client. And, people were they didn't want to come to this country, period, or they weren't given visas. We had people denied visas who were supposed to be part of the Human Rights Conference. People I know from like the UK, because they went to Cuba, so they suddenly couldn't come to this country. They were denied a visa. I think that's really, and it's interesting, Pride here, we've seen the challenges that the really large prides are facing, whether it's less corporate sponsorship, issues around some attendance, but it's the smaller prides that I'm really seeing growth. We had a Pride, I live in Montclair, New Jersey. It's a nice suburban town out, not far outside Manhattan. We have 20,000 people show up in the rain on last Saturday. And there are not 20,000 queer people in Montclair or even like sort of in our area. I mean, people do come from far away. It's a cool town, but it's families. It's families with queer kids, families with kids who are not queer. It's our allies. It's our friends. And they come together because they know how important this is. And they knew how important it was to come and celebrate. But those booths there was a lot of politics going on. There was registering to vote. There was Garden State Equality. There was House of Venus, which is working to provide housing for trans women of color. There, the Newark LGBT Community Center. All of those folks, they show up because people were really engaged and interacting. Because they were, our No King protest was at 10 and Pride didn't start till noon. So we got to do everything on the 15th, which was my mother's birthday. And ironically, she always hated that she has the same birthday as Trump. But that's what gives me, some encouragement and hope around this, is seeing that younger people are not having it. And as they, come into their own and are already out there doing stuff in the streets, they're going to be primed and pumped to do the work, which is great because I'm getting old.
Well, thankfully we still have you, because I always feel better after talking with you. Thank you, Cathy, for joining us on The Gaily Show.
Absolutely, John. Thank you for the work you do. It's really, really important, especially now.
We're all doing what we can right now. And speaking of doing what we can, you can connect with the task force at their website, thetaskforce.org. While you're there, you can donate to their critical work, and you can also sign up for volunteer opportunities and to take action. They have also announced the dates for Creating Change. It'll be in DC next January, the Creating Change Conference. So stay tuned, sign up for the updates related to that. Conveniently, the task force is at the task force on all social media: YouTube, Threads, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook. Really easy to remember, at the task force on social media. Coming up next, I'm going to continue my Queer in the Cosmos essay series. We've got one last break, but lots still to get to here on The Gaily Show on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, at WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk, where facts matter. Welcome back to The Gaily Show. I'm John Parker. We're coming up on the top of the hour. I close out our Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episodes with a weekly essay series called A Queer in the Cosmos, an opportunity to understand queer life through the exploration of the cosmos. Rather, you can only hear it here on The Gaily Show. Here is my latest essay, Lightyear 17. Who are we when we travel in space? In last week's essay, I introduced us to Nelly Ben Hayun Stepanyan and her project, the International Space Orchestra. She's a queer Armenian Algerian from Valence, France, my Armenian family's hometown. I read a profile of her in Shown magazine from earlier this year, and quoting here from that article, on the subject of who should be the first to return to the moon, Nelly is clear. It should be queer people. We are the only ones who can express ourselves in ways that will make us much more adaptable to space. And I haven't been able to get that tantalizing possibility out of my mind. Who are we when we travel in space? The original Star Trek series envisioned a future where space travel was not segregated by race and gender, and this resulted in the first interracial kiss on American television. In 1976, there was an LP, a record, called Inside Star Trek. On it was a track titled The Star Trek Philosophy, and Gene Roddenberry, the show's creator, said, quote, "The whole show was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins, not just to tolerate, but to take special delight in differences in ideas and differences in life forms." At the time, that was not happening at NASA. It was famously segregated by race and gender, right down to the bathrooms. Star Trek: The Next Generation envisioned a future where space travel was taken a step further, and that it was not segregated by humanity. Humans, alien species, and even AI embodied in Commander Data would be working and living together, relying on each other for their survival. That being said, there was still fierce interspecial competition and battles between Romulans, Cardassians, Vulcans, and humans. In science fiction and popular stories found in Marvel and DC Comics, an indicative piece of evidence that heroes are actually heroes is that they create teams and societies of marginalized individuals and peoples. Despite this, science fiction as a genre was fiercely segregated by race and gender in terms of its authors and publications. And the majority fan base of the Marvel Cinematic Universe has shown itself to be vindictive in its racism and sexism, actively attacking films and TV shows that feature women and people of color. See Captain Marvel and Ms. Marvel as evidence. Yet they champion Guardians of the Galaxy, a team of individuals who despise each other when they first meet, have completely different sets of values. But yet they laud the Guardian films and comics for how the main characters not only set aside their widely different worldviews and political leanings, including the usage of lethal force, but they create a found family with each other. However, when those fans are faced with including characters and actors into the franchise who do not share their sets of values, instead of creating a shared space to find joy together in the MCU, they viciously attack and dehumanize them. How we imagine space travel in fiction is very different from how we have practiced space travel. That being said, it can't be denied that while there is still much work to be done, space travel and study of the cosmos is more integrated and cross-national than it ever was, and we find weird dichotomies. There's the $10 billion James Webb Space Telescope, a marvel of scientific ingenuity that is named after the NASA administrator James Webb, who was complicit in federal efforts to remove all gay and lesbian employees from NASA in the 50s and 60s. Yet today, the James Webb Space Telescope's senior project scientist is Jane Rigby, who identifies as a lesbian. She's an astrophysicist who James Webb would have actively tried to keep out of NASA. And yet, Rigby received a Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Biden in 2024, in part for her work on the James Webb Space Telescope. 5 space agencies in 15 countries partnered together to manage the International Space Station. While we imagine space travel is moving beyond nationality, its origins and current management are very much rooted in national identities, politics, and government budgets. Funding is too often left to the mercy of nationalists. But all of this may be because we're still within the gravitational fields of Earth. If we make it past there, further out, onto Mars or onto a larger space station with thousands of people, not a dozen, and we're soaring past Jupiter, who will we be? What constructs, rather, will be there to enforce national identity? Who will police gender? Who will regulate queer relationships, interracial relationships? We think of space travel as complex sets of technology, of computer systems, of fuel systems, and navigation systems, but what about complications of human relationships? No doubt national identity will determine who makes it aboard in the first place, Americans undoubtedly. But what government will enforce American citizenship and rights when that space flight makes it past Jupiter? MAGA is kicking out trans people from the military and wants to extend the ban to all queer people because of so-called unit cohesion concerns. Arguably, if they have control, queer folks will not be aboard any space travel because we might imperil, quote, unit cohesion. And what about birth control? Will there be the ability to have babies in space? If not, what types of birth control will be on board? Will there be medications to induce an abortion? Or will everyone be sterilized? How will holidays of differing faiths be handled? Businesses today argue and fight about which holidays will be considered paid days off. You'd be surprised how mean these fights are if you already haven't been in one. We will take a lot of human BS with us when real space travel en masse begins, no doubt. But when Nelly Ben-Hayou-Stepanian was asked who should be the first to return to the moon, and she claimed queer people because, quote, we are the ones who can express ourselves in ways that will make us much more adaptable to space. What does that even mean? How are queer people creating spaces on Earth that would make humans adaptable to the loss of the power structures on Earth that regulate and police gender, race, nationality, and sexuality? I'm going to have more on that in next week's Queer in the Cosmos essay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you again to Cathy Renna from the National LGBTQ Task Force. You can visit them at thetaskforce.org. Up next on WCPT 820 is Choose Views with Richard Chu. On AM 950 Radio, it's the Matt McNeil Show, and stay tuned after that for Native Roots Radio. Stream us everywhere you get your podcasts or at youtube.com/@TheGailey Show. Connect with us on Blue Sky. We're at thegaileyshow.org on Blue Sky. And until tomorrow, keep it queer, America.